Hey, Cypher here. Today I wanted to highlight a problem plaguing American public history by responding to a reaction video that tried to defend the Alamo against my criticism. Now firstly, I know when I tell you not to attack them, some viewers will anyways, just to cause drama. Don't do that. Flame wars help no one. I won't name them until after the introduction for the sake of avoiding a flame war. The point of this video is not to counterattack, but to give you guys a way to spot malignant influences that purport to be on the side of history. You see, that's what makes me angry. Not the reaction video itself, but the flagrant abuse of my profession for their reactionary agenda. The reaction video comes from an organization out of Texas that, as far as I can tell, is merely a crusade to protect Texas from the criticism of historians. It is not affiliated with the Texas State Historical Association, nor any public history institutions, yet the host pretends to be so. You can tell this is a fundamentally unserious group from the fact that they paraphrase Ben Shapiro in their channel description. They also have numerous videos complaining about how history has become too woke. Scrolling through their Twitter and Facebook, it's full of complaints about wokeness, diversity, critical race theory, and political correctness. All things that anyone purporting to be a scholar would know is quite disgraceful. Normally, I would not respond to such prattle, but because the organization is used to attack scholars, as though it were a public history institution rather than a lobbying group, which it actually is, far too many people are falling for this nonsense. In fact, I took it seriously myself at first, at least until halfway through the reaction video where they straight up lie numerous times, and then end up with this little bit.
God in Texas, y'all.
Hooey! But it gets so much worse than that. They're using the popularity of far-right funding to gain support from this and implement far worse historical denialism in Texas. Sadly, they've been somewhat successful and have gone fairly unnoticed. But today, that changes. Oh look! Their website specifically states that they're scared of cynical historians. Because I can apparently destroy Texan identity.
He's too dangerous to be left alive.
Imagine being this afraid of me. I'm using this video as a teaching moment, to show how to spot someone pretending to be serious about history, but in fact is a reactionary weirdo using a so-called defense of history as a cudgel against political enemies to suppress the very history they pretend to defend.
One more thing!
I've shelved this episode several times, having originally recorded this in 2023. It seemed below me and too mean-spirited. Reactionaries are generally only worthy of the ignorance they peddle, as in never responding to them. I will break down the funding and darker intent of such inaccurate prattle, which also means that I'm dismantling someone's career. Furthermore, it came to light that this organization's host had some sort of illness, and I did not want to harm her recovery. That was numerous months ago, and her reaction video received a boost in the algorithm, even having sponsored links, meaning someone paid for it to get more exposure, leading to a torrent of vile comments, as I've come to expect from such maliciously motivated media. We all have our own biases, but the far right is definitely more denialist. It seems that reactionaries are becoming successful in turning people away from history and towards conspiracism. Just look at the educational goals that the current administration has. I'm working on an absolutely massive video about the history of attacks on education throughout American history. This reaction video I'm responding to is just a tiny little part, one which cloaks their open hostility to history with calls for neutrality and objectivity, neither of which exist, nor could possibly fit their warped perceptions. So this is but a small example of how reactionaries have managed to push the Overton window rightward. First, I'll show how their defective attempt at critique reveals this group's clear inadequacy, and then I'll dive into the ideological and financial underpinnings of how reactionaries pretend to be legitimate. When I've gotten complaints from people who are openly reactionary or worse, I normally pay them no heed. They cannot have anything of substance to say about history because they hold an ideology opposed to the historical method. Reactionaries are on the far right of the political spectrum, seeking to claw back social progress to preserve an imaginary purity of their nation. I'll often hear people refer to far-left bigots as reactionaries, but we have words like tanky and grievance-monger to refer to them. Reactionaries typically use anti-left-wing and anti-intellectual rhetoric, which can manifest in the form of simplistic red-baiting like McCarthyism, or more subtle forms, such as complaints about diversity is ruining media. All of this with the goal of yanking acceptable discourse further rightward and eventually reversing advances that marginalized groups have made. Reactionary politics are essentially backlashes to progress. Basically, they're further right than conservatives because they no longer wish to merely conserve the status quo, but to push it backwards. Reactionaries will often cloak that hatred with a so-called defense of true history. Right off the bat, you should be wary of anyone proclaiming that as though it were their identity. Protecting a character revealed by history is called nationalism, which was a malign export of orthodox historians that we as a profession have left behind half a century ago. I have numerous episodes about that alone, because protecting a national character is perhaps the single falsehood about history that caused the most harm, yet remains popular today. A nationalist isn't a patriot, for a patriot can acknowledge one's nation's wrongdoing. A nationalist cannot, because that tarnishes their flimsy identity. If your identity requires protection from the mean old historians talking about history, Texas doesn't stand a chance. Which is when we get to the Texas History Trust. They are a private advocacy group masquerading as a public history institution. The organization's website is pretty obviously reactionary, literally starting with the statement that they're here to do battle against warped history that's in the name of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and other emotional appeals. Yeah, that's solidly reactionary right there. Also, the line in the sand thing is an Alamo myth. Even the Alamo Museum makes a point of saying so on their own statue of it. The main person who runs their media campaigns is Michelle Haas, who made the video in question. She's a graphics designer with no historical background, yet clearly the trust receives enough money to allow her to continue pushing this garbage. Hence why she so hideously lies about my video, which has in turn granted her a bit of popularity from the crowd of denialists that I've opposed for a decade now. It's always funny when I get somebody saying that, oh, you've changed, I don't like how political you've come. It's like, did you see that I've been doing this since literally 2013 and talking about politics and history and that? Literally from the beginning. So one thing Haas repeatedly lies about in this video is the content of the Alamo's exhibits at the time I was there. She claims numerous pictures were from 2018. This is false. I showed only one photo from that year because, as I said in the original video, I was not allowed to bring my camera in. Unfortunately, I couldn't take any photos inside that time because of their rules of reverence. I literally had to walk back to the hotel to leave it there. In 2022, I had a GoPro rigged to record from my backpack, but didn't need to because the Alamo had updated their policy. Furthermore, she claims that an exhibit was open in the exhibit hall.
That exhibit remained in place with few exceptions until the Ralston Family Collections building opened in March 2023. Reactionaries,
when it had actually been closed, since they were building a new building. That's the point in the video I realized that she wasn't affiliated with the Alamo and was on her own little crusade. Then there's the part where she says that I'm lying about there being nothing about the Confederacy's use of the Alamo on the timeline panels, pointing to the timeline that merely talks about the Confederacy's existence.
Earlier, though, you cycled through all the panels, including the one that shows the Alamo under Confederate control, exactly where it should appear in this condensed timeline.
If she had actually seen these exhibits, she'd know that's incorrect, since that section makes no association between the Alamo and Confederate control. The closest we get to what she is saying here is a panel that says, when Texas joined the Confederacy in 1861, all federal military facilities, including the Alamo, were surrendered. The Alamo continued to be used as a military warehouse. Notice the use of passive voice there. By whom? Yet, she surreptitiously avoids the fact that Texas seceded to preserve slavery and cuts out my clear statement to that fact. And the use of the buildings by Confederates, which that rebellion was obviously motivated by the preservation of slavery. So she lies about the video in order to avoid a clear statement about the Civil War being caused by slavery, which the Alamo does not acknowledge, nor does its defender here. That's a key component of my criticism. Is this because of lost cause or beliefs? Why, yes. But we'll get to that. I have an entire video on understanding that myth if you're unaware of how deep that misconception goes in the South, which Texas absolutely is a part of. Finally, she claims the word invasion is never used and complains that I don't show it.
There is no language about invasion at the Alamo. I assume the reason you're not illustrating this claim with a simple photograph is because no such thing exists.
Well, that's because I couldn't get a good enough picture with all the people milling about and a reenactor in front of it, but it was on one of these two panels. Texas law does not allow me to show people indoors, so that's why you see people's faces blurred and everything. Oddly enough, despite denying that it's there, she feels the need to countenance the term by pointing to one of the Alamo defenders using it.
You know who referenced Santa Anna's force as invaders? William Barrett Travis in letters written from the Alamo in 1836.
As though somehow that justifies the misconception and the hatred that flows from it. Claiming that Santa Anna somehow invaded his own country allows xenophobes today to denounce the so-called invasion that Trump and his supporters want to ethnically cleanse the United States of. So yes, this is about modern politics, and only bigots say it is somehow not history, which of course this reactionary does.
Is it? Is it obviously a modern political statement? Or are you just offended that the Alamo describes the defenders as heroic?
It's typical of denialists to claim any history that disparages their flimsy white supremacy is modern politics. As Edward A. Freeman and John Robert Seeley said back in the 19th century, and the American Historical Association adopted as a foundational tenet in 1901, history is past politics and politics are present history. Her reaction video is chatter conspicuously consisting of completely contemptuous calumny. Try saying that 5 times fast. So the basis of her entire critique falls apart as soon as those lies are exposed. But there is so much more wrong with her video. One of her big gotcha moments is when I talk about the use of the Alamo for anti-Hispanic sentiment. She puts this silly graphic up going, no, 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 when I say this. Passing the 1924 Quota Act, severely limiting Latino immigration.
Actually, the Johnson-Reed Act 100% did not target Hispanics. Mexico, as a matter of fact, was completely exempt from the Johnson-Reed Act.
Well, I was very correct, and she is pushing a major misconception here that further plays into anti-Hispanic sentiment. While Mexicans were exempt from the quota, the act placed a head tax on anyone crossing the border, which severely limited Mexican immigration. Not to mention the already extant literacy, port of entry, and sanitation requirements, one of which had accidentally immolated several Mexicans. This was intentionally in response to Mexico having halted all border crossings from the US in 1921 and being used by Jewish immigrants as a free port after the earlier 1921 Act. The Quota Act was very anti-Semitic. It also established the provisions for creating the Border Patrol, with specific language to include the Texas Rangers, who were famously racist and extremely lethal to Mexicans. The time in Texas history known as La Matanza, or the Slaughter, when Texans killed numerous Hispanics, upwards of 300 to 500, in a series of massacres and lynchings, had just ended a few years prior, and the Texas Rangers were deeply implicated in all that violence, having participated in the worst massacres of the period. That entire time, the Alamo invasion myth was used to promote such sentiments. It's inherently violent. I mentioned this in the original episode, which she of course cuts from her reaction video, so when someone denies an atrocity, consult the narcissist's prayer. It goes, "That didn't happen, and if it did, it wasn't that bad, and if it was, that's not a big deal, and if it is, that's not my fault, and if it was, I didn't mean it, and if I did, you deserved it." Those who deny atrocities privately wish it could happen again, but don't want to tarnish the public perception of their identity. And at risk of getting ahead of myself, yes, she not only denies La Matanza, but turns around and claims it wasn't that bad before ultimately concluding Mexicans deserved their lynchings. But we'll get to that later. She also brings up Joe the Slave, who escaped the Alamo siege to bring word of it to Texians.
The first messenger of the Alamo's fall was a black man, an enslaved black man named Joe. There is no Alamo story without his testimony.
This is somehow supposed to show that the Alamo and Texas Revolution were not about protecting slavery? It's odd that she doesn't explain why Joe was there in the first place. His master was the commander of the garrison, William B. Travis, who held Joe there as a manservant. That's quite the omission, but that section of my episode was about the slavery-related causes of the Texas Revolution, let alone the more than 12% black residents who get no representation through avoidance of the issue of slavery throughout the site altogether.
Why is slavery the only way to represent African Americans?
While I disagree that it was a main cause, this is not a refutation of that whatsoever. The Alamo does not show Joe's story, so this shouldn't even be part of her video, but since she refuses to engage with that topic of discussion, I need to make it that much more explicit. The reason why Joe was there in the first place was that Travis was his slave owner, in direct contradiction of the Mexican Constitution that he claimed to uphold. Texians had repeatedly flouted attempts to stamp down slavery, leading to a series of disturbances in Anahuac. Travis had been a leader of the slave owner faction during those events, and Joe was likely one of those slaves he fought to keep. There is a direct line from the Alamo to slavery, and both the museum and its supposed defender here avoid that history. So her position is far less defensible than the Alamo itself was. Now, I don't want to get bogged down with correcting her point by point. I think I've adequately shown that she is a malignant influence that shouldn't be taken seriously.
He's already dead!
Instead, I want to focus on how she refuses to engage with the topic of my episode itself. Literally, the first line explains the clickbait title. I know that's an inflammatory title, but now that you're here, you can learn about some museology, a very underrated topic on YouTube. Yet, she skips over that to defend the Alamo. I even clearly state that I liked the Alamo in 2018, but found it to have regressed in 2022. The Alamo is trying to project a new interpretation of the site. They can only do so subtly because it is a contested interpretation, and has only recently been implemented. They are subverting expectations of triumphalism by broadening the context of racial diversity in 2022. The difference between the two times clearly showed that they were avoiding some of the interpretive subversion that the 2018 visit showed. So I'm not the hater that she pretends I am.
Don't be another Alamo partisan relying on claims made by others.
More importantly, she refuses to treat the Alamo as a museum, and in fact makes several key mistakes revealing that. She talks about attendance being the people that the Alamo serves.
Furthermore, the Alamo serves more than just Texas. They serve the visiting public. That same demographic data shows that more than half the Alamo's visitors come from outside of Texas, more than 10% from outside the U.S., and only 7% are locals. So that's who the site serves.
No, a museum is not an attraction. It serves its public as a representative of that community. I actually specify that in the original video. That's what a museum is. They serve their community by interpreting items through exhibition and protect their collections in perpetuity. She says that a charitable organization cannot seek profit, and that somehow disproves what's often called the Second Battle of the Alamo.
DRT has always been a charitable organization, so nobody was trying to make a profit.
Though charities and museums are in fact limited in how much income they can take, they must make some sort of money in order to fund their existence. She also thinks that representing the Mexican forces would require the current Mexican government to request that, which is just a bafflingly bad take.
And I don't think Mexico's ever requested such a thing. There's a cemetery in Mexico City for Americans who died in the Mexican-American War. Why? Because the U.S. Congress asked for that and paid for it and pays to maintain it.
A museum should strive to interpret the past in ways that help its community, and not representing the people who died in larger numbers during the battle is certainly not achieving that goal. Heck, perhaps the Alamo could explain that Santa Anna's force took less casualties than would be expected for a frontal assault on a well-defended position. Typically you expect to take 3 times the casualties of the defenders, but in this case, it was only twice. And they executed all of the defenders that were left. This all is best represented when she repeatedly defends the use of the Alamo as a shrine to Texas liberty.
Probably the word shrine is what's problematic for you. The Alamo is a historic site with a long multicultural past, and a part of that past makes it a war memorial. People from around the world make a pilgrimage to pay their respects at the Alamo Church for that reason. So, in order for it not to be triumphalist, the Alamo should memorialize the Mexican soldados or stop calling the place a shrine. The Alamo will retain its title as the Shrine of Texas Liberty.
Once again, the original video directly addresses this, but to reiterate what she refuses to, a museum cannot simultaneously require a triumphal narrative and an honest interpretation of the past. These are contradictory missions. Their mission is to preserve the Alamo, the shrine of Texas liberty, and bring its own unique story to life, to inspire visitors and honor all those who lived, fought, and died here. You can tell from that statement they have a particularly celebratory mission. Requiring triumphalism means they will purposefully avoid history that tarnishes that narrative. Of course, bringing its own unique story to life means that it would have to bring up those things, so their mission statement is actually inherently contradictory. So, for instance, I went to Boston recently, where I visited several museums. The Freedom Trail, despite its obviously triumphal labeling, went out of its way to avoid triumphalism. Every site had discussions of slavery, for instance, even though Massachusetts abolished the institution in 1781, with a few exceptions, of course. It was honestly pretty cool. Clearly, museums are capable of doing better than the Alamo did in 2022. That's what I expect. Now, I did despise the old State House trying to analogize the Tea Party to January 6th. That was dumb. But the exhibit asked people to critique it through interactive scales, which naturally most people voted against. We also went to the JFK library, which was so much worse than the Nixon library. I'm genuinely disappointed with that, though it was still a bit of fun. Maybe I'll make an episode about that stuff, and the reason I was out there, the Edu Hangout. That way I can include some more refined criticism like I did with the Alamo and Nixon Library. The point is that the original episode was about how to think about museums, and this reaction video does not engage with that whatsoever, instead spinning this whole defense of the Alamo. But much like the 1836 battle, it is a doomed position, easily overrun by a superior force. So does that mean my original episode is irreproachable? No. Of course not. I make mistakes all the time. That's why I always include a place to put errata in the pinned comment, and have already made 2 diatribes about that specific thing. But did I find anything incorrect in my work through this reaction video? No. Perhaps I relied too heavily on one of my sources, but it is impossible to tell when someone is going to such lengths to lie about my work. So, what can we learn in this exercise? Well, first, there are many red flags you can spot when someone is purporting to defend history. If they confuse the past with history, or have anything that says history is objective, they are wrong. History is a discipline, a non-fiction genre of publication that follows a discrete method. For instance, she claims that the authors of Forget the Alamo are journalists, not historians, as though they can't be both.
It was not, as your caption suggests, a book written by historians. It was written by journalists, and, the proof is in the pudding.
¿Por qué no lo estás? They wrote a book that is far more accurate than her blog, and it shines a spotlight on the anti-Hispanic and slavery-related history of the Alamo. Yes, journalists typically make for terrible historians, but they remain historians nonetheless if they've produced history, unlike the Texas History Trust. Trying to halt historians from revising our interpretations of the past is a sure sign of a reactionary, which means they're incapable of producing history. All new scholarly works revise old scholarship. All history is revisionist. That's a basic tenet of not just history, but truth itself. If someone ever complains about wokeness or whatever buzzwords that simply mean truth they cannot handle, then they are not scholars. The sad thing is, history requires defense, but it needs defending from nationalists, not for them. This is a particular problem in states like Texas, where you have a massive push to punish teachers and claw back rights. It is a reactionary agenda which intentionally causes harm. Historians must defend history against this hatred. But you've seen the timestamp by now. You know this isn't ending with simply defining what a reactionary does. No. This goes so much deeper. Frankly, I had this whole thing completely shelved away until I learned that Michelle Haas had successfully campaigned to remove books about slavery from Texan plantation museums. So not only is she going after scholars on her little tirade channel, but she is a very real detriment to the history profession. It was time to dig into what the hell is going on here, and wow, it is far worse than I initially suspected. So let's talk about the so-called Texas History Trust and their reactionary opposition to history. It's not even a non-profit, despite their claims to be so. They have bylaws listed which state it's a corporation, but there is no such corporation listed in the SEC, nor Texas Secretary of State. In fact, they didn't even publish anything on Facebook until 2021, despite claiming it's been around since 2006. That's why their website specifically disclaims, Texas History Trust is not a chartered bank or trust company or depository institution. It is not authorized to accept deposits or trust accounts and is not licensed or regulated by any state or federal banking authority. The Texas History Trust is a side venture from a boutique publishing company called Capano Bay Press. They mostly reprint old books about Texas history, but also function as a vanity press for authors to pay for their printing, including Haas herself with some eyebrow-raising titles. The first one I want to point out is Why I Hate Texas. Now this one is pretty funny actually. With a title like Why I Hate Texas, it's just a blank book. That's pretty funny. I guess you can fill it out yourself. But one that seems to be the beginning point of all this nonsense was Haas's 200 Years a Fraud. When 12 Years a Slave was popularly adapted into a film, she clearly became upset by the depiction and attempted to disprove it, but without the help of proper citation or methodology. Hilariously, even the title is severely inaccurate. Solomon Northup released his account in 1853. Her book came out in 2017. That means her very title is 18% inaccurate. She gets a B- on mathematical proficiency alone, let alone all the other nonsense that is below the cover. Unfortunately, the book was not available for interlibrary loan or digital preview, and I'm certainly not paying for denialist literature. Instead, I had to go back to r/askhistorians. Her criticism seems to be the simple fact that the book was ghostwritten and therefore can't be trusted somehow. Having a ghostwriter does not make an autobiography unreliable, and most slave narratives were ghostwritten. Most former slaves were illiterate. Slave states mostly prohibited slaves from being literate, like by law. Perhaps the ghostwriter, David Wilson, spiced it up a bit. People do that in their own memoirs all the time when they write it themselves. Historians Sue Eakin and David Fisk explored the inaccuracies in the book, which they found to be pretty minor. I myself also reviewed the movie a year after it came out, though admittedly in my old style that I dislike now. It was based on CinemaSins. Ugh. Didn't say anything wrong there, just not a good format. Doesn't get to the heart of the matter. Despite all of that, Haas felt the need to go further and denounce the entirety of the original book purely on the basis of being ghostwritten. And it gets worse. Tellingly, the second chapter is titled, I'm White. Here's a very telling excerpt from that, as told by prolific Redditor, Secession is Illegal. Great username. She then denies that she has ever had much interest in defending the South from the denigrating attitudes that still exist toward the region that my state is lumped into. The author says that this is unfair. She claims she is neutral because her home state of Texas wasn't much of a slave state in the 19th century. I'm a Texan after all. I don't actually have a horse in the slavery race. Texas isn't even culturally Southern. With the exception of East Texas, slavery did not exist here on any grand scale as it did in most of the states that comprise the Confederacy. At a loss for words, I facepalmed here and managed to flick up a bit of my hair. So now y'all just get to deal with a little bit of my hair sticking up the whole rest of the video. Oops. But here we can see that Haas is a lost causer. Texas absolutely seceded for slavery's sake. They were very clear when they stated in their Declaration of Secession, Texas was received as a Commonwealth holding, maintaining and protecting the institution known as Negro slavery, the servitude of the African to the white race within her limits. The controlling majority of the federal government, under various pretenses and disguises, has so administered the same as to exclude the citizens of the southern states, unless under odious and unconstitutional restrictions, from all the immense territory owned in common by all the states on the Pacific Ocean, for the avowed purpose of acquiring sufficient power in the common government to use it as a means of destroying the institutions of Texas and her sister slave-holding states. The federal government is now passing under the control of our enemies, to be diverted from the exalted objects of its creation to those of oppression and wrong. Meow. Yeah, I don't like reading this stuff either. It's a bunch of slavery BS, but hey, you may not have owned slaves in your previous life, King Richard I, but you certainly liked massacring them. And realizing that our own state can no longer look for protection, but to God and her own sons, we, the delegates of the people of Texas, in convention assembled, have passed an ordinance dissolving all political connections with the government of the United States of America. Look, I know that was a painfully long quote, but it is necessary for lost causers. They are denialists, and so they can't stand to have that stuff read to them.
Nope, I don't want to hear. Checkmate! They care not for the blood of...
Texas is absolutely a southern state, and slavery is an incredibly important part of how Texas developed. To deny that is to deny history itself. Given that kind of nonsense is in her book, you can see where the Texas History Trust is coming from. Once it diverged from the Capano Bay Press during the pandemic, it essentially became a blog of tirades to protect Texan triumphalism from the mean old historians revealing the stains upon that supposed glory. The first post is from Haas stating slavery was not a major issue in the Revolution. I've already shown that it was in this video and others. It wasn't primary, but it's a lie to say that slavery wasn't a major part. That's why the Anahuac disturbances finds no mention in her article. Indeed, the location has never been said on the website whatsoever. Not once. A far more odious post came soon after, titled "Land is for Winners," where she basically taunts American Indians for losing the wars of conquest, never mentioning the numerous broken treaties along the way, let alone ethnic cleansing, as one historian put it, necessary to incorporate that land. She uses the typical toddler reasoning of, well, the other kids were doing it too, this time by justifying conquest with intertribal warfare as though two wrongs make a right. In an article 3 weeks later, she explicitly invites violence by stating, "We aren't giving the land back, but any who would like to go the conquest route, come and take it." I need a refill on my whiskey, this is terrible shit.
I don't much like the tone of your voice.
This kind of rhetoric would have lost her any credulity a long time ago, but it plays to reactionary interests, and there's plenty of support for that crap in Texas. So, meet J.P. Bryan. He's one of Texas History Trust's key allies. He invited Haas to give an unhinged rant in front of the Texas State History Association's donors. Hence why she wrote this fawning article about him. He's a retired oilman hell-bent on preventing Texas history from becoming what he calls woke. His family has much influence on the TSHA due to key participation, with him having been president in the 80s. He made his personal collection into a Galveston museum in 2015. He misperceived that Texas history was going amiss during the pandemic and decided to effect change through fundraising, including through paying for endowed chairs and forcing his way onto the Texas State Historical Association through a bailout, then suing it anyways. He openly claimed that President Obama was a secret Muslim, saying, "I really think he has a totally different agenda from one that's good for America. I think he either hates America or he loves something else so vastly more. Or he's enamored with something that's not America, that he's going to promote it over us." Yeah, the guy who increased drone strikes on Muslim countries is the guy who's secretly a Muslim. Yeah, sure. Okay, buddy. That should reveal just how bigoted the man is. 10 former presidents of the Texas State Historical Association signed an open letter that stated, J.P. Bryan is a classic case of a Trojan horse, appointed to the TSHA staff under the guise of helping to improve the association's finances. He has instead made the TSHA the latest front in the culture wars, a development that few in the organization wanted and that threatens the very survival of the TSHA as we know it. History shows that the first thing authoritarian governments do when they come to power is shut down the archives, censor what is taught and written, and produce propaganda glorifying a mythical past that they promise to restore. For 126 years, the Texas State Historical Association has provided multiple platforms for serious historians of all ideological or methodological persuasions, be they professional or non-professionals, to explore our state's astounding history. We call on all TSHA members to resist the current efforts to fundamentally change the way the TSHA operates, to politicize it, and to remake it into a heritage group, or worse, a propaganda organ. Oil money lets you get away with some really heinous junk, doesn't it? He's instead using the private advocacy group, Texas History Trust, to assert his reactionary agenda. God, I despise this shit, but it needs some exposure. When President Trump threw a tizzy fit about the 1619 Project and made his own 1776 commission in response, which I had multiple live streams covering all of that nonsense, Texas had its own version called the 1836 Project. Just like Trump's farce, Texas's was also malignant, and guess who testified before it? Yep. Her testimony is the standard reactionary tripe of, historians focus too much on the bad parts. This is a playbook from 2 decades prior, but sure enough, the committee listened. Texas now requires all new citizens there to take a pamphlet produced by this committee, which historians criticized as promoting a sanitized version of Texas history. This whitewashing campaign extends to teachers who are increasingly fed far-right hogwash, including propaganda like PragerU. About a third of grade school textbooks cater to Texas, and you bet this will affect them. It's a real possibility that the Alamo regressed because of all of this rhetoric. They're even getting professors fired for speaking out. This is a very real attempt to stop history from being made. I myself may suffer career-wise for this very episode. The Texas History Trust is merely a cog in the machine of reactionary backlash. I'm making an episode about the history of moral panics, and this whole scare about so-called wokeness is indeed an example of what kind of fear-mongering a moral panic engenders.
Yes, you got lots and lots of trouble. I'm thinking of the kids in the Knickerbocker, shirt-tail young ones. You got trouble! Oh, we got trouble! Right here in River City! Right here in River City! Gotta figure out a way to keep the young ones moral after school.
The Texas History Trust became a YouTube channel initially to post clips of Haas's testimony, but quickly morphed into another place to post rants. She started a 3-part series decrying woke history, where she complained that teachers were supposedly indoctrinating kids into cultural Marxism, an old Nazi conspiracy theory, that vocabulary meant to be considerate of others is really a plot to confuse people enough to support that indoctrination, and the social justice that Texan museums supported with their exhibits was part of this conspiracy. The very next series she started was the worst denialism yet. She calls any historians who wrote about La Matanza an enemy of the Texas Rangers. Yes, she's got an entire series denying mass murder. She even attacks the project meant to document and produce scholarship on the topic, called Refusing to Forget, as being untrustworthy because they have an agenda. Despite having produced numerous works and creating a digital primary source collection, she says,
"Their claims are of an emotional nature and very few are backed by evidence."
Sure, they're the ones that do that. She even goes so far as to claim that the 300 to 500 dead Hispanics, a number she denies, all deserved their fate because of the panic engendered by the Plan de San Diego, a call for race war during the Border War of 1911 and 1920. The killings associated with that plan were tiny in comparison to the numbers perpetrated by Texans, which you can learn more about in my border episode. She uses the cowardly tactic of supposedly adding context for these fears without outright stating that this justifies the hundreds of lynchings to follow.
The rest of the context is vital.
The constant need to justify fears of Mexicans in a border state, and her whitewashing of subsequent atrocities, signals her denial that these lynchings were undeserved. Suffice it to say, Haas follows the narcissist's prayer pretty closely. I would say she's comically ignorant of what the Texas History Trust is, if I didn't know that this kind of hateful rubbish was effective. So long as you cry that the historians you're attacking are the real biased ones. Ooh. Bias, emotion, agenda, or whatever have no effect on whether something is true. When I talk about something pushing an agenda, I talk about it specifically contradicting the truth. Here, the existence of an agenda is enough to prove that it's not true. You see this kind of comment all the time where it's like, oh, you're biased. Whoa. But no, it's just the truth. And yeah, I'm biased towards it. Notice that she never shows citations or a bibliography, because that would require some verifiability and easily reveal her ignorance. Hence how we get all the way back to the reaction she made to my video. Since it became their most popular episode, the Texas History Trust focused on YouTube, practically abandoning the website. As such, I'm sure she's gonna make a bunch of videos about me now, and probably even label me an enemy of the Texas Rangers. But I thrive by receiving reactionary hatred. It proves they cannot withstand the truth, and that I'm hitting exactly the correct topics. If the Texas History Trust hits back without removing all of their disgraceful content, then they've proven themselves inferior to even what I expect of incoming college freshmen. Mind you, the lack of citation already places them below high schoolers. The Texas History Trust capitalized on her lies about my work in order to promote more denialism. Sadly, it is of course effective. Haas got in the news recently because she'd been spamming emails to Texan officials about books available in a plantation museum's gift shop. This is a plantation that was reliant on slavery and then later sharecropping, alongside convict leasing. These books were your typical fare of anti-racist histories like Anderson's White Rage and Kendy's Stamp from the Beginning, but it also included works about slavery, such as an autobiography of a slave girl, a book of Texas slave narratives, which were mostly dictated, so Haas doesn't see them as legitimate according to her Vanity Press book, and Haley's novel Roots. Sure enough, she got 25 books banned and even gloated about it, saying, "Remember those politically charged books being sold to the public at state-run history sites? Those are gone now. We worked hard to make that happen." She's a book banner. The Texas History Trust is purely a campaign for ignorance and hatred. The pattern is clear from the beginning with Haas's book denying 12 years a slave. Decry the mean old historians in order to steadily claw back historical narratives into a triumphalism that supports regressive policies. It's reactionary politics in the guise of defending history. Historian John Lundberg said the Texas History Trust's YouTube channel is the equivalent of white supremacist screeds about how academics have it all wrong. Don't be fooled by reactionary tripe. They are a malignant weight upon the history profession, dragging anyone downward into a spiral of bigotry. There are so many advocacy groups like this. By pretending to be legitimate historical organizations, they propagate an agenda that specifically opposes the history profession. A famous example is the innocuously titled Institute of Historical Review, which peddles Holocaust denial. A similar sounding group to the Texas History Trust was the Texas Educational Association of the 1950s. which provided funding to schools in exchange for them limiting enrollment to white Christian students. Seriously. While nowhere close to the same organization, because that 1950s one was literally pro-Nazi, and I'm quite sure that the Texas History Trust isn't like that, it's still this weird right-wing attempt to appropriate history. PragerU is probably the most influential of these masquerades. The university in its title is facetious, using the guise of so-called educational content to push right-wing propaganda on students nationwide.
At what age is it appropriate for watching PragerU videos that a third grade teacher had shown their kids Prager videos? A decade ago, this teacher would have been chased out of town with pitchforks. They've run over the educational establishment. Parents, man the barricades.
Haas is but a small fish in a massive pool, swirling around a drain, hoping to coax outside observers to jump in with the rest of these doomed dregs. Perpetuating myths, lies, and conspiracism about history always serves a political purpose, an often nefarious motive to distort truth to coerce conformity. As we can see from this example, reactionaries pretend to defend history from the big mean historians who are supposedly too biased, all while pretending that their agenda of hatred is the objective truth, thereby proving how great their nation is. Denialists deserve the very ignorance and ridicule they peddle, for they lack the rationality necessary for argument. History needs defense, not to preserve some flimsy sense of national pride, but for the sake of truth and justice. States like Texas are actively engaged in such denialism by having PragerU as official curriculum. The best I can do is use my platform to raise awareness of such hatred masquerading as historical defense with videos such as these and previous ones. That's why King Richard I decrees for this entire channel, bigots get banned. You can't rationally argue with reactionaries, they're too dishonest, so only denounce them. Anyways, on with the King outtakes, because there were plenty. Sinking 1, 2, 3. Hi. Say hello to everyone. Say hello. Look at the camera. Look over there. Look over there. Meow. Oh, really? Meow. Meow. King. Because they hold... King. What are you gonna do? What are you gonna do? What are you gonna do? Hi. You wanna say something? Oh, now you're quiet, huh? Well, thank you. Yes, you're a good boy. It's called... Meow. Meow. Go in there? Go on. Meow. Hiya. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, you're a good boy. Yes, you are. Even though you tend to be a nuisance when I'm recording. Meow. 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 You... Meow. Okay, you went out. Ow. That's the worst place to claw me. Hi, thank you. Oh. You want this? Go get it. Just... King is bored. He's falling asleep now.